Good evening. Welcome to the Community Library. My name is Jenny Emery Davidson. I'm the Executive Director of the Community Library. And I've been so looking forward to this program with the Sun Valley Museum of Art, Idaho Public Television, and Henry Whiting. As everybody settles in, I want to read a short poem to help us all settle in. This was a poem I needed today. This is by Ada Limon. She is the current Poet Laureate of the United States. Instructions on not giving up. More than the fuchsia funnels breaking out of the crabapple tree, more than the neighbor's almost obscene display of cherry limbs showing their cotton candy-colored blossoms to the slate sky of spring rains, it's the greening of the trees that really gets to me. When all the shock of white and taffy, the world's baubles and trinkets leave the pavement strewn with the confetti of aftermath, the leaves come, patient, plodding, a green skin growing over whatever winter did to us, a return to the strange idea of continuous living despite the mess of us, the hurt, the empty. Fine then, I'll take it, the tree seems to say, a new slick leaf unfurling like a fist. I'll take it all. And now I turn it over to my friend and colleague, Courtney Gilbert.
Thank you, Jenny. Good evening. I'm Courtney Gilbert. I'm the curator at the Sun Valley Museum of Art. And together with my colleagues, Christine Brittal and Jennifer Wells Green, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's screening and conversation. Thank you so much to Jenny and to Martha and Carter and the entire team here at the library for hosting us. We're really grateful that we have such a nice partnership and are able to use this space. And I also want to thank them for live streaming the event tonight. So hello to those of you who may be watching from elsewhere. And then I'm just incredibly grateful to Henry Whiting for making tonight's event possible. You're going to learn a lot more about Henry's deep connection to Teeters Knoll as you watch the screening, but he has lived in and owned the home and studio, which is the only Frank Lloyd Wright structure in Idaho, for more than 40 years. And I confirmed that with him tonight, and he said it's been 42 years and 5 days as of today. Henry trained as a landscape architect, but he has an extensive background in architecture that you'll hear more about. And he's stewarded Teeters Knoll through 2 extensive restorations in the time that he's owned it, making it the jewel that it is today. I want to thank Idaho Public Television for sharing their most recent episode of Idaho Experience with us here tonight, part of which is focused on Teeters Knoll. Following the screening, Idaho Public Television's Andy Lawless and Forrest Berger, who are the producers and directors of this episode, are going to join Henry and Brent Hale in conversation here on the stage. Brent is the son of Kent Hale, the stonemason who completed much of the extraordinary stonework at Teeters Knoll, and also the stonework on the LDS church here in Ketchum. And so finally, I've really always enjoyed the library's tradition of recommending a book. And I want to suggest tonight that each of you take some time to read Henry Whiting. He's written 2 books on Teeters Knoll. I'm going to put down my clipboard. This is one of those 2 books. At Nature's Edge, Frank Lloyd Wright's artist studio. It's got a beautiful foreword, too, by an architect I really admire, E. Fay Jones. So, and it's got amazing photographs and really the inside, behind-the-scenes story of the construction of Teeters Knoll. So it's available here at the library, and I hope you'll check it out. Thank you. And now I'm going to hand over the microphone to Bill Manny of Idaho Public Television.
Well, I didn't know I was supposed to bring a book or a poem. But we did bring these QR codes. And there's a stack of them on the table at the back. And if you pick one up, it will link you to all of our work at idahoptv.org, Idaho Public Television. Though as I think about it, I do have a poem. Roses are red, violets are blue. Thank God for Henry Whiting for inviting all of you. been to screenings when we did not have such an enthusiastic audience. So thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to the community library, to Jenny and Martha, and to Art Museum, Courtney and Christine, and all of you. We really are grateful for this opportunity. As executive producer at Public Television, I get to work with a fantastic team, two of whom are here, Andy and Forrest. You want to raise your hands? Andy and Forrest, they're the producers for this show. But I get to work on Outdoor Idaho, on Idaho Experience. I get to work with the team that produces Idaho Reports, that does Science Trek, and also our newest program, which is called Created, which is an art show that Marcia Franklin is producing for us. It starts online, but it ends up on air. So you as history buffs and architecture buffs and Sun Valley buffs should pay attention to Created. So a new show that I think you'll be interested in. But we're here tonight for Idaho Experience. That's our history show. It is entering its 8th season this fall. So we're at work on our 8th year. And what's coming up will be a show called Hidden Treasure in May, about treasure that's either been lost or suggested that it's lost in the hills and lakes of Idaho. We're producing a show called the Nisei Paradox, which will focus on the young Japanese Americans who were interned at Minidoka, who refused induction into the military when they decided that a nation that didn't treat them as citizens wasn't going to get their military service. It ended up being quite a cause célèbre in the 1930s, and we have a show that will air in August on that. And then in December, we will have a show profiling Frank Church and Jim McClure, two Idaho senators who were born in 1924, and we are in the 100th year of both of those important and critical Idaho senators. So watch for those shows. We've got some really good content coming up. And we can't do those shows, and we can't do this show without support from people like you, foundations, organizations, and individuals who give their generous support to Idaho Public Television to give us the time and the money and the travel to go find Idaho's hidden gems. So with that, I think we can let the show begin. Thank you again, and enjoy the show.
Idaho Experience is made possible with funding from the James and Barbara Semino Foundation, devoted to preserving the spirit of Idaho, from Ann Balakay and Louise Nelson, from Judy and Steve Meyer, the Friends of Idaho Public Television, the Idaho Public Television Endowment, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
The interesting thing about history is we can find evidence of it all around us. Idaho has played host to the likes of pioneering explorers, mining booms, and celebrated novelists. We've even experienced our share of natural disasters. The team at Idaho Experience is continually seeking out the spectacular and the culturally enriching. In this episode, we've dug deep to uncover 3 historic nuggets: an eclectic museum with a flavor all its own, a prolific artist who commissioned an architectural landmark, and an influential photographer from the early 20th century. Nuggets we're calling Idaho's hidden gems.
Clarence Bisbee was a young man growing up in Nebraska. I believe he was the youngest in his family. I think he was interested from an early age, at least in magic. And maybe that sort of boosted an interest in photography as he got a little older. And he ended up close to the age of 30 going to photography school in Illinois. And there he met a young man named Charles Deal, who in 1904 came out west and started a newspaper out here in the new town of Twin Falls, Idaho. And he convinced his buddy Clarence to come out and see for himself what this area was like. So I believe Clarence hopped on a train and got as far as Omaha. There he supposedly flipped a coin to see if he was going to hop on the next train to Texas or the one that was heading for Shoshone, Idaho. Whether it was heads or tails, it came up for Shoshone. He came out here and caught the stage into Twin. At that time, there was no bridge on the Snake River Canyon. Bisbee came out in 1906, probably at the behest of Deal because they realized that this was a new opportunity.
In fact, the Twin Falls Land and Water Company had just completed the Milner Dam, so that water was being irrigated in 1905. So Bisbee gets here in 1906. Obviously, part of what the Twin Falls Land and Water Company wanted to do was to demonstrate that they were open for business, that good things were happening.
And indeed they were, thanks to Congress passing the CARY Act, also known as the Federal Desert Land Act. It helped pave the way for Idaho's canal system. Potential homesteaders flocked to the area in droves, looking for good deals on land.
The Twin Falls Land and Water Company was going to need to sell this land, and one of the ways they could sell it was through photography.
That was music to the ears of Clarence Bisbee, so he rolled up his sleeves and he went to work.
His first studio was a tent. I think his quote is that he took a picture of every ditch and headgate in the region. And he was taking pictures of the agriculture and the beginnings of the town and anything that he thought might attract people.
But like any entrepreneur starting out, it took a little time for things to click.
He wasn't actually hired officially by the canal company at that time. Later, he was officially hired as the photographer of the North Side Canal Company project. But in the early days, he was just taking pictures and then seeing if he could pass those along.
Then Bisbee had an idea. Why not offer up his photos to be used in marketing brochures?
Clarence lucked out because he wasn't necessarily the first photographer in Twin Falls, but he was one of the first to be here and sort of take advantage of the opportunity of these brochures. And I think he did fairly well for a few years. He would get requests for up to 1,400 pictures a month from some of these businesses and promoters back east. And then into the 1910s, he was selling postcards. In a year, I think he could sell about 50,000 postcards.
By that time, Bisbee had married Jessie Robinson. Their relationship was close, in marriage and in business.
We don't know a ton about Clarence Bisbee or his wife, Jessie Bisbee's early lives, but we do believe that they met or knew each other at least in Nebraska. She was about 9 years younger than Bisbee was. They were married in 1910. And when he would traipse his 50 to 60 pounds of negatives and cameras and other photography equipment around, she was right there with him. But she's a writer, she's a poet, and so she turns things around a little bit and starts to appeal to a different aesthetic, especially as they turn to some of the studio photography. And in fact, when he moves his studio into one of the buildings, he advertises it as the Bisbee Electric Studio, because now he can use lighting to light his subjects and also to run some of his equipment, especially for processing photos. But by the 19-teens, we're starting to see that a lot of land is being sold, or now it's more of an investment instead of people coming out west. There's not the high interest in promotion as you saw before. Eventually other photographers moved into the area, and I think there was kind of a saturation in the market. The Bisbees also started to invest in their own parcels of land. And in fact, I believe they owned 11 or 12 lots in and around our area, as well as I think there were a couple of those lots that were in Nevada. And so into the 1920s, in the late 1920s, we were starting to see that they might have been sort of land rich, but now they were very cash poor. Of course, you get the Depression on top of that. Then you get foreclosures and you get the people asking for money. As she gets a little bit older, you're starting to see the worries of the money coming in. She starts to document, if not on a daily basis, on at least a weekly and even a monthly basis, how much they owe. And you can tell that that is uppermost in her mind at some point. Jessie Bisbee died in June of 1936. She had been ill for some time. Toward the end of her life, her worries were starting to overwhelm her a little bit. I don't know that that was a direct cause, definitely, of her death, but I think it probably didn't help while she was so ill.
Jessie's illness and subsequent death seemed to drain some of the life out of Clarence.
When Jessie passes, I think Clarence is virtually retired. And in 1937 or 38, he is promoting a new photographer that's in the area that's coming in and running now the Bisbee studio. And by 39 or 40, the studio is out of his hands. I think that he was probably as destitute as you could be in those days, unfortunately.
But in his heyday, Clarence Bisbee and his camera seemed to be just about everywhere.
If it was a parade, he was there. If it was the opening of staged version of Mikado, he was there. There's some great moments that he captured on film that would have never been captured without him. One of my favorite pictures is when World War I was over, and he must be standing on the courthouse steps of the crowd that was out there to celebrate Armistice Day. I think that's incredible. When Bisbee passes away in 1954, still miraculously, he has most of his glass plate negatives, if not all. And they were still all in really good shape. And there were about 2,200 to 2,500.
Gus Kelker, DeWitt Young, and Dr. Wallace Bond bought the collection from Bisbee's heirs for $1,500 and donated it to the Twin Falls County Museum. The collection eventually found its way to the Twin Falls Public Library.
And then in 2000, we started a grant with Blit Printers to digitize the entire collection. So this is a picture from when William Jennings Bryan was here speaking in Twin, and this is at the Perrine Hotel. And the resolution is so great that we can zoom in quite a bit. We can see Bryan there talking, and you can see beside him I.B. Perrine and Robert McCollum, who's with the Twin Falls Land and Water Company, and somebody who has fallen asleep apparently.
As far as Jim Gentry can remember, this is the first time he'd seen Bisbee's originals.
That is quite a picture.
Isn't that one fun? That's Bisbee himself, standing down there.
Jim was hired to interpret the photos in the early 80s, but he worked with slides, not the glass plate negatives.
The thing that really strikes me about Bisbee, he was showing life as it was taking place at that time. And that life is very interesting in terms of interpreting its meaning. What Bisbee saw is what you and I would want to show. If you lived in Twin Falls and you have visitors, where do you want to take them? You want to take them to Shoshone Falls. You want to take them to the Twin Falls. You want to take them to the Perrine Coulee. But he was also looking at how people made their livelihoods. So lots of pictures showing harvesting of crops, and of course he was always showing the big crops, the success stories. He is interpreting and trying to make this area appealing to you as a potential investor or a purchaser of land.
But I also think that he was very interested in art. And later we see that definitely in the motto that he chose to etch at the top of his studio, which is "Life and Art are one." And I think that he thought that everything that he was doing was part of that artistry. And then of course you've got photos of the people, and he's taking pictures of his neighbors and people that he comes across all the time, and I think that kind of shows as well that he had a connection into this community.
Clarence Bisbee's role in promoting the Twin Falls area during the early 20th century cannot be overstated. Not only have his photos stood the test of time, but like the photographer himself, they are nothing short of iconic.
And they are very well preserved. Now the glass plate negatives just live in some drawers and are kept quiet and dark and safe, and we get to enjoy the photos with another generation.
High above the Snake River in the Magic Valley sits an architectural masterpiece, the only Frank Lloyd Wright designed building in Idaho, Teeter's Knoll. Its story reflects the confluence of 5 bold personalities: the country's premier architect, a famous Idaho artist and his wife, a mason with a wealth of talent and stone, and a preservationist with a love of design. Their aspirations combined to make Teeter's Knoll the unique gem it is today. Its existence is due to the great success of an Idaho original, Archie Boyd Teeter, a prolific artist who painted magnificent landscapes and captured some of the rich history of our state.
He's an extremely interesting and, in a simple way, a very complicated individual. And he was from an extremely poor family. He never finished 8th grade. His teacher kicked him out of class for doodling rather than doing mathematics. He wanted to paint. And I don't think he thought at that time that, he needed any more education than that. He had no formal art instruction until winter 1921. He had classes at the Portland Art Museum. But he was painting prior to that time, self-taught, absolutely self-taught.
The subject of his paintings often drew upon the landscapes and the Western life he observed.
Archie had spent time in the late teens and 20s in the Hagerman Valley, and then he and his friend would fish for sturgeon in the Snake River and salmon, because salmon still came up into the Hagerman Valley. And then they would haul the fish up to the miners in Haley, and that's how they made a living.
As a result of his working along the Snake, he got a lot of material that he would paint about. I don't think he saw himself as a historian, but his art, there is a great deal of history, and especially history of the state of Idaho. He painted at least 24 mining scenes, just from memory, to record what it was like in those days. And he's also did a painting of what a logging camp looked like at that time. No, that's a marvelous record, and that should be taken advantage of.
In the summertime, his restless nature would carry him and his paints from Boise by mule to the heights of the Sawtooths, mountains that stirred his passion for majestic landscapes. Over the years, his nomadic adventures would deliver him to the town of Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where breathtaking views of the Tetons would inspire a lifetime of work. It was here that he'd meet Patricia Wilson, who would become his wife and help Archie grow into an artist of international renown.
Patricia knew a lot about art. She was an artist herself.
Patricia was his sole gallery person, as she was all his life.
The view of Teeter is that he was a painter of the Grand Tetons. Well, yes, he certainly did that.
He could paint the Tetons from memory. And the story has it that somebody came into their little gallery in Jackson and said, "Oh, Mrs. Teeter, we just love Archie's work, but it's just, a little bit too expensive for us." And she said, "We'll come back in the morning. I'll have Archie paint you a smaller one tonight."
Oh, he was enormously prolific. He one time said that if he painted for a couple more years, that he would be over 10,000, he'd be the most prolific painter of all time. Now, whether that's right or that's wrong, he was enormously prolific. In the 20th century, there was no Western painter like him.
Archie was probably the most famous artist in Idaho.
Patricia's business acumen would capitalize on Archie's success and position them financially to commission a world-class studio from one of the 20th century's greatest architects, Frank Lloyd Wright. From Archie's years in the Hagerman Valley, he knew the ideal location for their studio, a place which came to be known as Teeter's Knoll.
The reason it's called Teeter's Knoll is because it literally is a knoll. Mrs. Farnsworth sold it to the Teeters for $125, and she thought she had just built these crazy artists out of a lot of money. But to her, it was useless land because you couldn't raise cattle on it. It's 2 acres in size, and there's a 150-foot cliff on the river side, and then the Snake River makes a big horseshoe bend in front of the site. It's just one of the most beautiful sites in Idaho, and Archie, with his artist sensibility, recognized that right away. And so they went to Wright with this site in mind.
By the time of the Teeter Commission, Frank Lloyd Wright was the most famous architect in the world. He pioneered the Prairie School movement and developed the concept of the Usonian home. His dwelling sought harmony with nature, and his plans for the Guggenheim Museum in New York would drive architecture toward a new frontier. A studio designed by Wright could signal to the world that an artist of great mastery occupied the space.
Clearly, the reason that they went to Wright was because it was a marketing thing for Archie. And virtually from mid-50s onward, every piece of promotional copy that she would do would always say that Frank Lloyd Wright designed his studio.
Wright's design and the natural resources of the rugged desert landscape would inspire one young mason from Oakley to produce a masterwork of his own.
Really, the great construction story of this place is the work of Kent Hale, which cannot have been easy because all the walls are angled at 60 and 120 degree angles, and it's a sloping site and the footing is stepped down and the walls are battered outwards below the windowsill level, so you have all this stuff enters into the calculation, and it's truly some of the finest rock work in any Frank Lloyd Wright house.
Well, I had been working through a fellow named Fred Reed, a contractor from Twin Falls. He called me one day and said, "I just got a plan here I'd like you to look at." And I went down, and when I saw it was a Frank Lloyd Wright house, well, I became very enthusiastic because at the time he was my ideal. I thought there's no one quite like him. He was right at his prime. No way I was going to miss this job, and so I did everything I could to get it.
He desired this job so much that he reduced his bid by about 1/3. He felt like if Frank Lloyd Wright could endorse the stone and promote his masonry, that would be his ticket to, big time.
He knew from his youth that they had this Oakley stone that was more beautiful than any rock he had seen. And at that point, he had even built this little fireplace for his parents outside their family home.
He was asked by his father to build this fireplace in honor of his grandfather. It's been in use for 75 years, and I still love it. I love to sit here and have a fire, and it's pretty much exactly how it was when he completed it. And this is his first attempt at anything significant out of Oakley stones.
As with many of Frank Lloyd Wright's designs, the plans called for locally sourced material.
The original floor plan calls for the rockwork to look like Falling Water, the famous house over the waterfall in Pennsylvania. Falling Water is built of sandstone, and so that's what Wright was asking for, was a horizontally laid rock.
And so when I saw that in the specifications, I looked around here and found where it came out natural.
So back in the late 40s, early 50s, as he was having dreams of becoming a stonemason and getting into the stone industry, he came up here looking for the perfect stone, and he came across this area, and this is where all of the stone for Teeter's Knoll came from. And this is a great example of what he was looking for. It's been in the weather for probably tens of thousands of years, so the edges are softer and it's got some lichen on it. And this one is another great example of maybe one that would be properly sized. This one hasn't been on the surface as long, but this is pretty much the shape that he was looking for.
Yeah.
And there was limited supply of it. And he picked up probably every bit of stone that had the characteristics that he was looking for to put it in Teeter's Knoll. It makes Teeter's Knoll that much more unique and special.
Yes.
Because that particular stone no longer exists.
Yeah.
Kent Hale's selection of Oakley stone would prove to be the spark to an industry that today infuses an estimated $250 million annually into the local economy.
This was the first major building that had ever been done in Oakley stone.
You can look at the prow and just see how straight it is. It's a 60-degree angle. I'm amazed that he was able to make it look so straight. It doesn't bow, it doesn't bend. He did everything perfectly. But if you look closely, it's also quite jagged.
Yeah, but as a whole, it reads as a straight line. Yeah.
It's beautiful.
The surface rock Kent gathered for the studio is referred to as floatstone. Laying it in harmony with Wright's design would be just one of many challenges he faced.
You know, this was Kent's first project, really, which is quite amazing. But Patricia thought that it wasn't proceeding fast enough. And she fired Kent with the building about 2/3 finished.
She felt like he wasn't doing a very good job. She made some disparaging comments to a local newspaper.
They sent in the little article that said they were a little bit delayed on constructing the building because they had to teach a stonemason how to lay stone. This was his last straw as far as I was concerned.
Ultimately, he couldn't take it much longer. She sued him for leaving the job. He countersued for non-payment. He won the lawsuit, but ended up getting 1/10 of what he bid on the job, so $700 of the $7,000.
He didn't get to finish the project, and some of the work here is really, really bad. This is one of the most interesting parts of the whole studio because right here you see Kent Hale's original work below the level of the windowsill, and then above the windowsill is some other mason's work. This is all composed order and this is chaos.
Chaos.
There's no relation between the parts.
Yeah, this would have been one that he left on the mountain.
Okay.
It's hard for me to look at it, being someone who appreciates my father's work.
Yeah.
I think Mrs. Teeter might have robbed the world of something special if she'd allowed my father to complete the job.
Yes.
One of the signature features Kent Hale did complete before being released from the project was the chimney. This one built to a grand scale.
The rock work that would be looked at more than any other place in the whole studio would be this. And so here on the interior you see lichen, and I love to point this out to people that's, 70 years ago that was put there, and that lichen is still alive and growing.
My father was an artist.
Yes, he was. He was.
Once construction was complete, the Teeters used the studio seasonally, splitting their time between Jackson Hole and Hagerman. In their later years, they gave generously to causes dear to them. They started the Archie B. Teeter Fund for handicapped children and supported important medical programs at the Mayo Clinic. Their nomadic spirit took them on adventures around the world. Archie collected images from exotic locations and brought them to life on his canvas back home. The studio would prove to be a sanctuary for the rest of their creative lives.
I have heard from friends of the Teeters that his most creative work was done here at the studio.
Archie Boyd Teeter died in 1978, but his spirit is alive and well in Hagerman, where the Historical Society purchased a new home that will display some of the 600 Teeter paintings they have in their collection.
We are so excited about this new building. This is going to be the Teeter Room, and in it we have Archie's easel, and we put here one of my favorite of Archie's paintings. It is of the Tetons, and it was part of the collection that we got from the Idaho Community Foundation. So we're quite pleased to have that in our room.
Patricia moved to California after Archie's death and passed away in 1981. The studio was abandoned and left to the Quaker Church. Its condition deteriorated until it was in a state of ruin.
You know, it looked kind of like a prison camp. There was a chain link fence with 3 strands of barbed wire. It really looked pretty bad. In any case, I was really intrigued. I started to conceive in my mind, this would really be a great way to learn hands-on about Frank Lloyd Wright, would be to buy this place and to restore it.
It was his uncle, Alden B. Dow, a student of Wright's, who gave Henry the confidence to take on the project.
So it's always been really important to me that the first person I asked about this was my uncle. He said, Henry, I think that's really a good idea that you do that for your life. And he says, as a matter of fact, I think that is such a good idea that if I were your father, I would loan you the money to make sure that you did it. And then he paused for a second. He said, but then it wouldn't mean as much. And he was telling me that I had to take responsibility for it. And that's been like one of the most important things ever said to me in my life. It's just one of these things that was just meant to happen.
After he purchased the property in 1982, his first order of business was to restore relations with Kent Hale.
Henry had a good enough eye to see that the original stonework was perfect, it was beautiful, and so he reached out to my father. There was still some hard feelings about the whole Teeter's Knoll, and Henry basically provided redemption for that mess that he went through in the 50s. I think he was really proud of it. I think he recognized that it was pretty much his showcase. It was the most significant job that he'd ever done.
Henry's preservation of the studio has ensured that Frank Lloyd Wright's legacy lives on in the Hagerman Valley, where upon occasion, he opens his private home to tours organized by local nonprofits, giving tourists an opportunity to see firsthand the mastery of mason Kent Hale and experience the breadth of Wright's creative space that is Teeter's Knoll.
Well, thank you all for coming. I appreciate you being here. You can't tell from here, but you're about to experience one of the most beautiful sights in the whole state.
It's just fascinating, and I can see why people are getting emotional as soon as they come around the corner.
It's all situated so that every window you look out, you have this amazing view of the river. It's just gorgeous.
I love how it definitely feels like an artist lives in the studio.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I think it is incredible. I love everything here, the rock, the view. I mean, I'm so happy I finally was able to come on a tour here.
To be able to showcase the architecture and the history of a private home, and then to have someone like Henry, who is an amazing steward of this home, it's a big deal for preservation.
Frank Lloyd Wright homeowners always talk about how they see something new every day in their house, and I would say that 90% of the time it's the relationship of the architecture to nature. At this point in my life, I spend a lot of times observing that. I have the time to watch the sun gradually come into the main studio room, and then the leaves are dancing on the floor, and then as the sun goes down, the light goes deeper and deeper into the main room. You get this amazing feeling of harmony. It doesn't require a manifesto to explain what's going on or anything. It's just visceral. You can just feel it. It really is like a chapel. It is a chapel to creativity, and creativity for an artist.
Idaho Experience is made possible with funding from the James and Barbara Semino Foundation, devoted to preserving the spirit of Idaho, from Ann Balakay and Louise Nelson, from Judy and Steve Meyer, the Friends of Idaho Public Television, the Idaho Public Television Endowment, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Hello. I'm Andy Lawless.
And I'm Forrest Berger.
Hale.
Henry Whiting.
You all hear Henry from back there?
I'm Henry Whiting.
What do you guys want to talk about?
I don't know. I think maybe we can talk about our show. We didn't get to show you Lawson's Legacy Museum, but that's kind of a fun piece. So if you ever get to IdahoPTV.org, you'll be able to watch that one. It's a funky little museum out in Grandview, Idaho. A lot of people don't know about, but it's kind of worth the visit.
It's also worth watching. It's quite entertaining because one of the founders, Belva, is just she's a woman of few words, but her story is in her eyes, so she has these great expressions, and you can get a read on everything she feels and thinks.
And when I Googled it, because I wanted to, when we came up with the concept of the show, we wanted to have a few different styles of pieces. And when I Googled it, and Andy and I went down, I said, Andy, let's go down and check it out. And we got in a vehicle and everything. We got down there and we drove down this long driveway with, rusted out farm equipment. I'm going, oh my gosh.
It looked like a junkyard.
It did. And then we get there, we tour the place, and for about 2 hours, maybe. And then when we got back in the vehicle, Andy goes, you just hit a gold mine. So if you get a chance, check that one out. But anyway, so I produced the Clarence Bisbee piece, and Andy was my chief videographer. He produced the Teeters piece, and I was his chief videographer. So we kind of...
Good tag team.
Yeah.
Anyway, go ahead. A little bit about Clarence Bisbee, though, because this is, and then we'll jump in. We'll bring you guys into the fold. But what got you interested in Clarence Bisbee?
About maybe 2 to 3 years ago, I did an Outdoor Idaho episode on called "The Barns of Idaho," and as I was going around, and there's some really great dairy barns down around Buell. And I had heard about Clarence Bisbee because I was looking for old photos and stuff like that. And so I went to the Twin Falls County Museum, which is actually in Filer. And was looking for barn photos, right? Old barn photos. And we went downstairs, and the lady got out these, books of photos, and I just went, oh my gosh, this is so cool. Because, old black and white photos are really, really cool. And so I decided, okay, down the road, I want to do a piece on Clarence Bisbee. And it just took me about 2 or 3 years to get around to it. But it was fun. It was a very interesting adventure. And there are so many photos. Because of our time constraint on this was a pledge show. It was about 42, 44 minutes. And Andy's piece, was longer.
Longer than it was supposed to be.
Yeah, that's okay.
It was
so
a comprehensive
the other two
story.
pieces I produced those, and he, said, and there's just so many photos that I had to leave out because of time constraints. But I think hopefully I captured some of the cool ones.
So the Teeters Knoll thing. I think Henry and I had been talking about doing something with Teeters Knoll for probably the last 8 years or so, maybe 9. And it's because Henry's fascination with drones, and he knew I owned one.
We're both drone operators.
So I would occasionally get an email at 4 a.m. from Henry, like, "Oh, Andy, wouldn't it be cool?" And so thanks to Idaho Public Television, we had the opportunity to break out some drones. But as with all these stories, there's a lot more that is left on the cutting room floor. So it would be nice to talk to you guys about some of this story that didn't make it to the screen.
Well, I want to say I didn't have anything really to do with the drones until the last time you were filming, and Andy mentioned that bald eagles do not like drones, and that and we had plenty of bald eagles in the area recently, and if the eagle were to take the drone out of the air, it would ruin his day as well as his drone. So I that's essentially all I did in terms of helping him with the drones. But what I really would like to say is that it was fun to see Kent Hale talking in that film, and that was in 1985. We did another PBS video of Teeters Knoll, and that was Kent talking at that time. And like Andy, or like it was said in the film, when I first bought Teeters Knoll, Kent was one of the first things I did was to find Kent, and I called directory assistance, which he did back in 1982, and in Oakley, and of course there's only one Kent Hale there, and I got him on the phone, and initially he was very skeptical and not warming up at all, and because this had been such a disaster for him. And as I gradually started talking to him about Falling Water and how much I loved that house in particular, and he started to understand that I really did know and appreciate what he was doing. And so at the end of 10, 15-minute conversation, I said, well, Kent, would you ever consider coming back here? And he says, well, maybe. And I said, well, Kent, when could you come? And he says, how about tomorrow? And that started a friendship for me with the whole Hale family that's lasted until today. And Brent's brother Kenneth was involved in that original video that we did. He didn't show up there, but he was Kent's tender in the beginning when we started to do some of the restoration work. And then that would have been in 1982 or so, and 1982 and 3. And then in 1996 or 7, somewhere in there, we did some more work, and Kent enclosed the carport, which was not being used at all. And Brent's other brother Dwight came and worked on that, and Dwight is an incredibly gifted stonemason. Unfortunately, his back won't tolerate, but that's one of the most arduous jobs you can imagine. And so I had never really met Brent until I'm going to say about 8 years ago or so. So
we met briefly once when you and your late wife Lynn came to Oakley.
Oh,
we
right,
were there
right.
for a couple of days, but officially and for more than just a couple of minutes, yes, about 8 years ago.
But Brent had never been to Teeters Knoll, and he had heard all about it all his life, and about what a disaster it had been for his father. And actually, his father would never talk about it with any of the children. The only way Brent learned about it was from his mother. And so when he finally came to visit, I get kind of choked up about this, but I let him walk in the front door first, and he raises his arms up like this, and he says, "I'm here." And I just got chills. I just got chills because I didn't really have any idea the full meaning of what that was, of a whole family disaster coalesced in that moment. And then Brent was here. And so we've become very good friends and fellow stone nerds over the years. So,
I just want to add that it as Henry mentioned, it wasn't my first visit. I had seen thousands of photos and I had followed the story, but about the time that you met my father and got him involved again in the studio, it was about the time that I left home. And I didn't have any stonemason talent at all, so I wasn't involved in either of the restoration projects. But I had seen thousands of photos, and it pales in comparison to actually being there. And it was a shocking thing for me to see the first time that I stepped through those doors. And so it was extremely emotional. It was quite an amazing experience. It was just thank you.
We both started crying.
I just want to add one thing to the stone nerd thing. In the film, you see maybe 30 seconds of discussion about the prow. That was about 35 minutes of filming. Our arms fell off.
Yes, they
from
did.
holding cameras, but we got what we needed, and that's kind of the nature of documentary film work. But I wanted to getting back to Kent, because as disastrous of a project as it was for him, he had a storied career as a stonemason. I mean, there's living proof in the neighborhood here. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yes. In fact, so since becoming more involved in Teeters Knoll, I've done a lot of additional research besides just what happened at Teeters Knoll, putting together timelines and those sort of things. And within a few years after the Teeters Knoll job, he was bidding for the Sun Valley Church, LDS Church here. And his bid was too high, and they chose to go with the brickmason's bid. And my father said, "I will do it for the same price as the brickmason." And so, he at that point in time, he was new in his career. He was young, and he was trying his best to promote Oakley Stone, and he knew that would be a showpiece as well. But he expected Teeters Knoll to be a showpiece. And he obviously had to give up on that. And it still is, it still was, but I don't think he was out promoting it like he would have if he had had an opportunity to finish the entire job. But he knew that with all the traffic going past here, that the Sun Valley Chapel needed to have Oakley stone in it. And so a lot of that stone, and this is sort of I don't know, maybe a sad thing, but I realized just within the last few years that some of that stone that ended up here should have been in Teeters Knoll, most likely. So it was sort of an emotional thing when I realized that.
Can we take it from the church and put it back in this?
I don't see why not. And the church just over here, and then this home right behind us here, the Lauder home, is also his stonework, and there are probably a smattering, half dozen to a dozen other places around this area that he has work. In fact, there's in Haley, I still remember him doing this probably would have been the early 70s, but he did the stonework that's, I think it's a brewery now. At one point, it was a little auto dealership, but you all probably know what I'm talking about. But that's his work as well. So, what was the question?
There wasn't one, but there's another anecdote to your father's story. It has more to do with Patricia, and this is again stuff that ends up on the cutting room floor. And I don't know, Henry, if you want to elaborate, but am I correct in remembering that Patricia had written J. Edgar Hoover about something?
I think that might be right. I haven't seen that letter, but I think that she wrote everybody she could think of, including the local newspaper, which required the lawsuit happening. But she was not pleased, and it really is unfortunate because it would be a perfect masterpiece if the stonework. The story also was that the Teeters decided to have a party one Sunday or whatever with plenty of wine and cheese, and they laid one of the back walls in the back part of the studio. And when Jack and I got there, that wall moves in and out by about 6 inches, and we had to fur it out so we had a place to build the cabinets to. One of the main things that I did at Teeters Knoll was to take the galley kitchen, which was, I think it was about 8 feet by 12 feet in size, tiny kitchen that was not for whatever, I think for the reasons of budget, that Frank Lloyd Wright designed it as a rectangle, and on top of all this, basically hexagonal what's the word? Geometry. There we go. The geometry, and that really bothered me. That just bothered my eye, and so I basically tore out the bathroom and the kitchen and moved it into the back space. There was a storage room in the very back, which they were apparently used for mixing paint and things like that. And Jack and I one day were tearing out the staircase. And all of a sudden, Jack finds a loaded .22 pistol, nine bullet pistol, and anyway, Jack immediately took the bullets out of it, but you never knew kind of what you were going to find. But that turned out to be a major project, and I think that it's a beautiful addition, and it really. Makes the everything consistent, I guess you would say, and that seeing those squares like that was just kind of horrific. Aside from the fact that the cabinet work was really cheap. I do still use the original kitchen sink though. That is original.
So I just wanted to also add. Patricia wasn't just upset at the stonemason. She was upset with other contractors. It wasn't just the stonework that she was writing to J. Edgar Hoover about. So apparently she alienated a lot of people.
Yes, she alienated 2 of Frank Lloyd Wright's apprentices, Robert Pond and Tom Casey, who were sent up to supervise the project. And for the Pond, Mr. and Mrs. Pond, who were living in Hagerman, she would only pay the electric bill after 5 o'clock at night, or some crazy thing like this, and they both had to leave. And actually, when I went down to Taliesin West in 1982, the first time, they remembered this as being one of the most difficult projects that Frank Lloyd Wright ever worked on, and he actually washed his hands of it in the end. He would have no more to do with it. So they were quite pleased to see one of their sort of their babies rescued. And despite the fact that I redesigned the kitchen, I went over the design with them before I did anything to make sure I got their approval. And they didn't. I wouldn't say they approved of it, but they didn't disapprove of it. But so they're very pleased with the way Teeters Knoll looks nowadays. So.
Is there also there's I'm recollecting a story that they were trying to lure Frank Lloyd Wright to the site with some of the trouble that they were causing? Is that accurate?
Yes, they would have. Mrs. Teeter would have liked nothing more than to have Frank Lloyd Wright come, and as soon as he got off the plane in Twin Falls or Boise or wherever it was, have all of the newspaper people there taking pictures of him. And essentially, I think, as it says, the studio was primarily used. It was used in all of their promotional material after 1960. That Archie Teeter was the only artist living in a Frank Lloyd Wright designed studio.
There's also, you told us in the interview, you mentioned that there's a relation that Patricia had to Lloyd Jones, actually, right? That there was to Frank Lloyd Wright. Can you share some of that?
Patricia was raised in Oak Park, Illinois, and was raised by her grandmother there. And she had been a student of Frank Lloyd Wright's uncle, Jenkins Lloyd Jones. It was called the Abraham Lincoln Center, and he was a prominent Unitarian minister. And she claimed that she was a member of his last class, and I'm going to say 1918 or something like that. And she used people who would write in 1952 when the Teeters wrote to Wright. He was, a very famous person, and lots of people would have liked to have him do a building for them. And so they always had a little try a little hook for him. And so she used that friendship or a relationship with Jenkins Lloyd Jones as a hook for him. And he bit, and did the design for them. It was originally, I think it was originally supposed to cost $15,000 to build, and so Wright was paid 10% of that, $1,500.
And he never visited.
And he never.
Right?
Sorry about that. He never visited.
He didn't take the bait.
His son-in-law, Wes Peters, came to lay out the footings where it actually sat on the site, which had to be an incredibly difficult job on that very rolling site, and it's a stepped footing, and it was rocky, and there were no trees on it back then. So, and back then the road, which is now called River Road, was old Highway 30. It was the main east-west road in southern Idaho. And now it's not even a secondary road; it's a tertiary road. And it's just amazing to think that big trucks and everything were driving by this place at that time.
Should we open it up to questions? If anyone has questions, there's microphones, I think, that can. You can use. Microphones distributed for you live streamers. Thanks for tuning in.
Henry, you mentioned Jack, and who was Jack?
There's a certain man sitting right here in front, and that's Jack McNamara. Jack was building Michael Engel's house south of town here, and I was asked to help out with a small piece of design work on that house, and I met Jack and Earl Engelman, who were doing it, and I just thought to myself, boy, if I ever do a house or build a house, this is who I want to do it. And the funniest thing happened. It was only like 6 months later. I had had the initial contact down at Teeters Knoll, and who should I run into at the Sun Valley Post Office but Jack? And I asked him if he would, well, first of all, if he would come examine the building to make sure it was sound and was worth a project worth starting with. And so basically we've been together ever since then, and I think it's really special. The next to Jack is Paul Bates, who's also been on it from the beginning, and we're still friends 42 years later, and we get together all the time, and it's been a really special. The people involved in the project over the years, it's been really special.
Did your uncle get to see you take over the project and do some of the renovations, restoration?
He did not get to see Teeters Knoll, but did you? If you saw the picture of the two of us together, that was taken at my parents' house in 1982, and he died about a year later. But he did come out to Idaho, and I kept him up on it for about the first year or so, until he passed away. But I know he would be very pleased with it. Yeah.
Hi, guys. Thanks so much for the presentation tonight. I have a quick question, construction-wise, and Jack may be the one to answer it. When did power originally get to that two Teeters Knoll? Did they have power from the beginning?
That's a good question. I think they probably did, though, because believe it or not, that was the main road, and it's a very narrow road now. But so I think they would have had power. But if I can say this, when we started the restoration, I was on a party line, and if you can imagine trying to do a complex project on a party line when there are a bunch of teenagers down the road hogging the phone, and you never know if they get back, if it will ever get back to you, and then finally, the second restoration project we did in 1996 with a different contractor. He had one of those original cell phones that were about that long, and there was one spot in the lower lawn where he could go and get reception, but he had to hold the phone at just the right angle or he'd lose his signal. I think it's hard to imagine that these days, but especially the remote, the party line was really a nightmare.
Coincidentally, Kent Hale also had a party line at that time. It's amazing you even got through to him.
So I had two questions. Henry, I'm curious, after you bought the house or decided to buy the house, when did you realize that there had been an issue with the stonework? And then, Brent, I had a question for you, which was, after your dad got back involved in the project, did that help to, erase some of the bitter feelings he'd had about the project?
I'll answer that first. When I knew basically nothing about this place other than there's a complete catalog of Frank Lloyd Wright's work that came out in 1974 by William Allen Storer, and there's a picture of the Teeter studio in it, and so I knew absolutely nothing about it. But when I got there, there were a half a dozen or a dozen cartons of correspondence and memorabilia, and one of the boxes on the top of it said Hail Mess, and it was all of Patricia's correspondence and things that she had received from them, and we gradually pieced together much of the story of the construction, and my first book was written up, based on that information. So that's how I found out.
As far as redemption, yes, 100%. So my father was mostly a quiet person until you got to know him quite well. Paul, Jack can both probably attest to that, Henry. But once you got him talking, he was a talker, a storyteller, entertaining man. That was a little bit different growing up in his family. He didn't necessarily behave that way around us. So he was more quiet and reserved when he was around us. But when I look at that even just that little clip of him from that 1984 or 85 piece, I can tell just by just the way he speaks and his smile on his face at that time that he was over it completely, 100%. So, which reminds me that I really wanted to kind of emphasize the point that Frank Lloyd Wright was one of his heroes, and he recognized that it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for him to get that job, which is why he did it for so cheaply. And basically, it turns out he did most of it for free. So anyway, yeah. So it was a dream, and he did all he could. And I have been researching this, and I have some of his correspondence with the Teeters still. And he was, to me, it seemed like it was outside his character to almost beg for and promote and be so aggressively attempting to get this bid. But I can see it in the correspondence. He actually even sent some samples of the stone to Frank Lloyd Wright to inspect, to make sure it was good enough for his tastes or whatever. So he was so, it was such a dream job for him. And then to have it end that way, I just can't imagine how he must have felt. He never spoke to me about it, as Henry mentioned. I didn't know anything about it. I played basketball in high school, and I played at Hagerman's 4 times, minimum 4 times. My father followed us everywhere we went. Never once in high school did he ever say, 7 miles up the road is the most beautiful stone job I've ever done. He never. I had no clue growing up. So that's how much it affected him. And so for him to come back and have his work recognized as, the beautiful work that it was, be offered the opportunity to come back and do additional work, yes, absolutely. In the end, it ended up being a beautiful story.
So Brent, did you ever see your father on top of the steeple at the church here next door?
I have photos. I was not born when he was doing that. I have photos of Dwight in the back of the truck in front of the church, and my father up the scaffolding, at the very top of the scaffolding there. But no, that was before my time.
Okay.
I don't know if across the street is the Episcopal Church. He also had the bid for that, but soon after he finished this church, he was in an accident and was laid up for about 9 months. And so his brother is actually the stonemason on the church across the street. So I know that wasn't part of your question. But as Andy and Forrest can attest, I can talk about rocks for literally hours. So
we call them stoners.
Well, I'm going to stay on the same subject. So as someone who's driven through Oakley quite a few times, I suppose, at this point, I always see the stacks of rocks. Your father being such an advocate for using the Oakley stone, is the quarrying of it something that your family is still involved in or was ever involved in?
That's where up on the quarry is where I decided I was never going to be a stone person. Yes, he had 7 claims, and in 1972, he ended up selling them, which is part of the contract was that he could go out and have his sons extract as much stone as he needed for his own work. So even though, yes, he was officially out of the stone selling business in 1972, he still continued to work the quarry. And yes, one reason why I ended up doing something completely different, a desk job, is because my fair skin for one thing, and my laziness for another.
Now, one thing about Oakley Stone is I'm not from Idaho originally. My family's owned property up north since 1946, but I grew up in Oregon. I had no idea about Oakley Stone until Andy said, hey, we're going to do this project. And to go out to Oakley and see that, and to go to the quarry, and to see, and just the town of Oakley, and you look around and, oh, there's some stone there, there's stone on that. It is really, really amazing. I had no idea the quality of Oakley stone until I was able to work with Andy on this project. And that's one of the great things about our job, is that we learn so much along the way about all kinds of things. And that's one of the things I really value about working, doing documentaries. So
I would recommend anybody to go to Oakley at some point, and maybe many of you have been through there on the way to City of Rocks, but the Oakley Cemetery is fascinating because most of the monuments there are done in Oakley stone, and it is really fascinating. It's being a Midwesterner, it's totally unlike any cemetery I'd ever seen because there are virtually no trees there. It's out in the desert up above the town. And it's really something. I don't know how many Kent did, but quite a few probably. So
I want to add. Oh, you got a question?
Oh, well, I was going to see if there were any more questions, but
Okay.
I actually have one question for you too. So.
Okay, I just wanted to add one more thing to what Forrest was saying about the joy of this job. Bill talks about, when Bill introduced this show, he mentions the support that we get from the community. And so much of the support is not necessarily financial. We couldn't have done this without Brent and the Hale Family Archive, and we couldn't have done it without Henry and him opening his house. We couldn't have done it without the Twin Falls Library and Jennifer, who opened up the Clarence Bisbee Archive, and Belva, who gave us so much information about Lawson's legacy. And it's true of every show that we do, and it's one of the real joys of working at Idaho Public Television is we go out into the community and we get the respect from the community that is kind of, there's a lot of gratitude, and I'm in awe of it, and I know I speak for you and I speak for Bill. It's a real joy that all of you showed up to see what we get to produce and tell Idaho stories is, anyway. Now I'm getting emotional.
Thank you all so much. One question for you too before we wrap it up. Is there a project you're working on right now that you're particularly excited about? Just one topic?
There you go.
Yeah, I am. I work for both Idaho Experience and Outdoor Idaho. So I kind of flip, go from one to another. Right now, I'm just starting up a project that's going to air in the fall for Outdoor Idaho on bees and the importance of bees. And so that's the latest thing I'm working on. We originally, when we started this show, it was going to be 5 segments, and we were going to have, an hour, and our fundraising 17 days got down to like 10 days. And so we kind of scaled things back. So there's a couple of other things that Andy came up with there for, one of them is on Cataldo Mission, which is the first thing that you saw. So there will be a segment on that and a segment on St. Gertrude's Monastery in Cottonwood that Andy came up with the idea of calling it Sacred Places. So we still need to, most of that's been shot, but we need to put that together. And then, I don't know. Andy, what are you working on?
I'm working with Bill on the Nisei Paradox, which he mentioned. And one of the cool things about that show is that we had the opportunity to film a play reading that basically shows that history through court documents. It's a courtroom drama. And it's written by a lawyer in Boise. And so it's a different way of telling the story through a theatrical device. And that will be, I think, a really fun thing about putting that together, is that we've got, this theatrical interpretation that is drawn from the actual history books. And then I'm also working on a fun piece about, I don't know if anybody here is familiar with the Honda Trail 90, but this will be an outdoor Idaho piece. The origins of that comes from a guy that in Boise named Herb Ewell, who's still alive and still riding. He's 92, still rides motorbikes, but he prototyped the original Honda Trail 90. So that will be our avenue into what has become adventure bike riding and other all-terrain vehicle riding that is so popular in our state. And then I'm doing another Idaho experience about Idaho and song.
He pulled me into helping him out on that.
We're filming a small club of riders on Saturday in Caldwell. But then another show called Idaho and Song that will look at the culture and the history of our state through music that we love. An example would be Curtis Stigers singing about 10th and Main Street, which celebrates the legacy of Gene Harris.
All right. Well, thank you all.
The last thing I will say, down the road, this is a long-term project that I hope I pitched to Bill and our general manager, Jeff Tucker. It's going to be maybe 2 shows, one IDEX show, one Outdoor Idaho, long-term down the road on the Snake River. So,
thank you, Henry.
I have one more thing. Can I add one more thing?
Wait, there's more.
We annually do a tour around Frank Lloyd Wright's birthday at Teeter's Knoll, and it's a benefit for the Hagerman Valley Historical Society. And this year it will be June 8th. It's on a Saturday, and you're all invited to come to that if you'd like. We have a great time because all of the guys like Jack and Paul who've worked on this, and Brent will be there too, are docents. And we have Lester Taylor, who was the man who spoke in this video, will be a docent this year, which will be a really thrilling thing. But the Hagerman Museum is having their opening on the Friday night before, so if anybody wanted to come down, you could make a weekend of it. And you can find tickets if you Google hagermanmuseum.org. The tickets will be for sale May 1st, and this is a major part of their yearly budget comes from this particular tour. So I hope some of you will come. That'd be great.
I want to add, based on personal experience, just watching this video or looking at photos is not enough. You need to see it in person.
And I can second that. Get your tickets as soon as they go on sale. It's extraordinary. Thank you. And thank you all.